October 1992, backstage at the Crocodile Cafe in Seattle. The Pacific Northwest music scene was at its peak, but cracks were already showing beneath the surface. What started as an underground movement had become a marketing phenomenon. Record labels were signing every flannel-wearing band they could find, and the term grunge was being thrown around by executives who'd never set foot in a Seattle club. Eddie Vedder arrived at the venue feeling the weight of sudden fame. Pearl Jam's debut album, 10, had exploded beyond anyone's expectations. They were selling millions of records, headlining major festivals, appearing on magazine covers. Eddie was 27 years old and struggling with what success meant for his artistic integrity. The spotlight was intense, the pressure constant. The Crocodile Cafe was hosting a small showcase that night, featuring several Seattle bands. It wasn't officially announced, just word of mouth among the local music community. Maybe 200 people in a venue that usually held half that. The kind of intimate show that reminded everyone why they fell in love with music in the first place. Nirvana wasn't scheduled to play. They were between albums, taking time after the massive success of Nevermind. But Kurt was there, sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a beer, watching the opening acts with quiet attention. He looked smaller than he appeared on the stage, almost fragile in his thrift store cardigan and faded jeans. Eddie spotted him immediately. Everyone in Seattle knew Kurt by sight now, though most people left him alone. There was an unspoken understanding that he valued his privacy, his space to exist without being the spokesperson for a generation he never asked to represent. But Eddie was feeling talkative that night, maybe because of the alcohol, maybe because of the pressure he was carrying. He walked over to Kurt's table without invitation. "Mind if I sit?" Kurt looked up, nodded toward the empty chair. His expression was neutral, polite but guarded. "Eddie Vedder," he said, extending his hand. "I know who you are," Kurt replied, shaking it briefly. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, watching the band on stage struggle through a cover of "Touch Me, I'm Sick." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A grunge band covering a grunge song for a crowd of grunge fans, all of it feeling forced and hollow. "This whole thing's getting weird, isn't it?" Eddie said, gesturing toward the stage. Kurt didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his beer, his eyes still focused on the performance. "I mean, look at this," Eddie continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Half these bands wouldn't exist without what we did. They're copying a copy of a copy. The whole grunge thing, it's becoming a parody of itself." Kurt's expression didn't change. He continued watching the stage, but Eddie could sense he was listening. "The record labels are signing anyone with long hair and a distortion pedal," Eddie pressed on. "MTV's got executives trying to figure out how to package authenticity. They're missing the point entirely. The thing that made this scene special, that raw honesty, it's disappearing. Grunge is dead, man. We killed it by making it successful." Eddie expected Kurt to agree, to commiserate about the pressures of fame, the corruption of their artistic vision. Instead, Kurt finally turned to look at him directly. "You think so?" Kurt's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Don't you? I mean, look around. This isn't what we started out to do. This isn't authentic anymore." Kurt nodded slowly, but his expression was unreadable. "Maybe you're right." Eddie felt a surge of validation. Here was Kurt Cobain, the reluctant king of grunge, agreeing with his assessment. It felt good to have someone understand the burden they were carrying. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, Eddie doing most of the talking, expressing his frustrations about commercial expectations, about losing the connection with their original audience, about the music industry's ability to drain authenticity from anything it touched. Kurt listened without judgment, occasionally nodding, offering brief responses that neither agreed nor disagreed with Eddie's points. There was something in his demeanor, a calmness that Eddie found both reassuring and slightly unsettling. Around midnight, after Pearl Jam's set, Eddie found himself back at the bar. The crowd had thinned out, but the energy was still high. People were talking about Pearl Jam's performance, which had been powerful and emotional. Eddie felt good about it, connected to the music in a way that had been harder to achieve in larger venues. That's when someone tapped him on the shoulder. "Kurt's going to play something," a voice said. It was one of the club's sound engineers. "Thought you might want to see." Eddie looked toward the stage. Kurt was up there alone, adjusting a microphone, his beat-up acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. There had been no announcement, no fanfare. People were just gradually noticing and gathering closer to the stage. The room went quiet as Kurt strummed a few chords, testing the sound. His fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease, but there was no urgency in his movements. He looked comfortable up there, like he belonged. Then he started playing. It wasn't a Nirvana song. It wasn't a cover of anything recognizable. It was something new, something that sounded like it was being born in real time. The melody was simple but haunting, built around a descending chord progression that felt both melancholy and hopeful. When Kurt started singing, his voice was different than Eddie had heard it before. Not the anguished scream of "Smells Like Teen Spirit" or the sarcastic drawl of "Come As You Are." This was raw and vulnerable, unfiltered by studio production or performance expectations. The lyrics were improvised, or seemed to be. Kurt sang about authenticity and artifice, about the difference between making music and making music for someone else. He sang about scenes and movements and labels that missed the point, but he didn't sing it with anger or frustration. He sang it with understanding, with acceptance, almost with pity. Everyone's looking for the real thing, he sang, but they wouldn't recognize it if it bit them. Everyone's trying to be authentic, but authentic doesn't try to be anything. Eddie found himself transfixed. This wasn't performance in any conventional sense. This was something more intimate, more honest. Kurt wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was just sharing something he was thinking about, something he was feeling, letting the room listen in on a conversation he was having with himself. The song continued for maybe 4 minutes, though time felt suspended while it was happening. Kurt's voice carried across the room effortlessly, not because he was pushing it, but because everyone was straining to hear every word. The acoustic guitar provided a simple backdrop, nothing flashy or technical, just service to the melody and the message. When he finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Not the expectant silence before applause, but the kind of silence that follows something profound, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. Then someone started clapping, and gradually others joined in. But the applause was different from what had followed Pearl Jam's set earlier. This was quieter, more respectful, the kind of response reserved for something sacred. Kurt unplugged his guitar, mumbled thanks into the microphone, and walked off stage. No encore, no extended interaction with the crowd. He was gone before most people realized the performance was over. Eddie stood at the bar stunned. He felt something he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, though there was an element of that. It wasn't embarrassment, though he was suddenly aware of how much he'd been talking earlier about authenticity and artistic integrity. It was more like recognition, like seeing something he hadn't known he was looking for. The room gradually returned to normal conversation, but Eddie remained frozen in place, replaying what he'd just witnessed. Kurt hadn't been trying to prove anything. He hadn't been making a statement about the state of grunge or the music industry. He'd just been honest in the most complete way possible. Eddie realized that his earlier conversation with Kurt had been him working through his own insecurities about fame and success, projecting his anxieties onto the broader scene. But Kurt hadn't been struggling with those same questions, at least not in the same way. Kurt seemed to understand something about authenticity that Eddie was still trying to figure out. 2 weeks later, Eddie was in a hotel room in Chicago, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror before a show. Pearl Jam was midway through a major tour, playing to sold-out arenas, living the rock and roll dream that most musicians only fantasize about. But Eddie couldn't stop thinking about that night at the Crocodile Cafe. He'd been carrying around a notebook, trying to write songs that captured what he'd felt watching Kurt perform. But everything he came up with felt forced, calculated. He was trying to write authentically about authenticity, and the contradiction was tying him in knots. That night in Chicago, Pearl Jam played one of their best shows of the tour. Eddie let go of his self-consciousness about success and commercial appeal, and just focused on the music, on the connection with the audience, on the joy of making sound with his bandmates. It felt like something Kurt might have approved of. After the show, a music journalist approached Eddie for an interview. The conversation inevitably turned to the Seattle scene, the grunge movement, the future of alternative rock. Do you think grunge is dead? The journalist asked, echoing the conversation Eddie had been having with himself and others for months. Eddie paused, remembering Kurt's quiet presence that night, his casual acceptance of Eddie's anxieties, his response through music rather than argument. I think grunge was never really alive in the way people think it was, Eddie said slowly. It was just some people making music they believed in, and other people responding to that honesty. When you start talking about it as a movement or a trend, you've already missed what made it special. The journalist scribbled notes, clearly expecting more analysis, more quotable insights about the state of alternative rock. The real question isn't whether grunge is dead, Eddie continued. It's whether individual artists are still making music that means something to them, regardless of what category it fits into or what market it's supposed to serve. Years passed. Kurt died in April 1994, and the entire music world went into mourning. Pearl Jam continued to tour and record, deliberately avoiding the commercial trappings that had made them uncomfortable, playing smaller venues, refusing to make music videos, fighting with their record label over artistic control. In interviews after Kurt's death, Eddie was often asked about their relationship, about what Kurt had meant to the Seattle scene. Eddie usually kept his responses brief and respectful, but in a 2004 interview with Rolling Stone, 10 years after Kurt's death, he opened up more than usual. I only really talked to Kurt a few times, Eddie said, but one of those conversations changed how I think about making music. I was going through this crisis about authenticity and commercial success, worried that we were selling out or that the scene was becoming corrupted by fame and money. What did he tell you? The interviewer asked. He didn't tell me anything, really. That was the point. I was doing all this talking about authenticity, and he just showed me what it looked like. He got up on stage and played a song that came from someplace real, without worrying about whether it fit into anyone's idea of what grunge was supposed to be or what the audience expected from him. Eddie paused, collecting his thoughts. I realized I'd been thinking about authenticity as something you could lose, like it was fragile and needed to be protected. But watching Kurt that night, I understood that authenticity isn't something you maintain or defend. It's just something you are, or you aren't. And if you are, then it doesn't matter what's happening around you, what labels people put on your music, what the industry does with your success. You just keep being authentic, keep making honest music, and let everything else sort itself out. Did that change how Pearl Jam approached your career? It changed everything. We stopped worrying so much about controlling our image or fighting the system and just focused on making music that felt right to us. Some people thought we were being difficult or stubborn, turning down opportunities that other bands would have jumped at. But we weren't trying to make a statement. We were just trying to stay honest. The interviewer pressed for more details about that night at the Crocodile Cafe, about what Kurt had performed, what the song was about. I don't think the specific words matter, Eddie said. It wasn't about the lyrics or even the melody. It was about watching someone be completely present in their music, completely unguarded. Most performers, myself included, we're always partly aware of how we're being received, how we look, whether we're hitting the right notes or saying the right things. Kurt wasn't performing for anyone but himself that night, and paradoxically, that made it the most powerful performance I've ever witnessed. The story of that night became part of Seattle music lore, though the details varied depending on who was telling it. Some versions had Kurt playing Nirvana songs acoustically. Others claimed he'd written a song specifically about Eddie's comments about grunge being dead. A few people insisted they'd recorded the performance, though no recording ever surfaced. But Eddie always insisted that the specifics didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson he'd learned about the difference between talking about authenticity and embodying it, between worrying about staying real and simply being real. In the end, Kurt Cobain didn't argue with Eddie Vedder's claim that grunge was dead. He didn't defend the Seattle scene or make a case for the continued relevance of alternative rock. He just picked up his guitar and showed everyone in that room what authentic music sounded like, regardless of what genre it belonged to or what cultural moment it represented. And in doing so, he answered Eddie's concerns more completely than any conversation could have. Authenticity wasn't about preserving a scene or protecting a movement from commercial corruption. It was about individual artists maintaining their connection to whatever made them pick up an instrument in the first place, whatever truth they were trying to express through their music. That night at the Crocodile Cafe, Kurt Cobain reminded everyone present that the real thing had never been about grunge or Seattle or any particular sound. It had always been about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to share your truth regardless of how it was received. Eddie Vedder learned something that night that shaped the rest of his career. Authenticity isn't something you lose or defend. It's something you choose, moment by moment, song by song, for as long as you keep making music.